CBSE Board, Class 11, History, Chapter 3, Part 8, Audio by Renee Matthew. We have to take a look at the processes which led to the change in the economic and social factors of the world and what it is, how it led to the change. The first factor is, of course, the environment. What happened in the environment? So most of the changes took place between the 9th and the 17th centuries, 9th to 17th centuries. So from 5th to the 10th centuries, most parts of Europe was covered with a vast area of forest. And we saw that the peasants always took refuge in the forest. And after all these things, from the 11th century, we can see that Europe entered a warm phase. Temperature increased at that time. There was a cold climatic spell which happened before this, and that led to prolonged winters. Growing season shortened because only during favorable climatic conditions they were able to grow things. So everything reduced and the yield for agriculture also reduced. So from the 11th century, what happened is after the cold climatic spell, Europe entered a warm phase. It was really very warm. The temperature increased and the effect on agriculture was very, very high. It was too high. So peasants did not have any growing season. It was very difficult to have the cultivation. The soil was also frosted and it was not very easy to plow the land also. Already they were into labor, they were doing hard labor. So along with the unfavorable climatic conditions, things became very difficult for them to have everything plowed and grow things on the fertile soil. Environmental historians, that is historic people, the people who study about the environment, topography and such kind of things. So that branch of study, the historians noted that there was a significant receding, that is going back of the forest line in many parts of Europe. Forest line was clearly cleared. It started getting cleared up. So now the peasants did not have any area to go and take refuge in. So much of the forest line was cleared. And that led to the expansion of the area under cultivation. Okay, so when the forest line cleared, definitely they had more access to land. And there was an expansion of the area. Cultivation was possible after that. Okay, so area was accessible to these people. And at that time, cultivation was actually possible also. Now, when we are talking about cultivation, we have to look at how the land was put into use. Now, agricultural technology was very primitive. People did not have much access to many things. They did not know how to plow the land because with medium available implements which was given by their lord, they had to till the land, plow the land and get the harvest. So now agricultural technology was very, very primitive. It was only with the basic things that the peasants survived and did something. The mechanical aid available to the peasant, the only kind of tools or implements which was available to the peasant to work on the field was a wooden plow drawn by a team of oxen. This is something which we see in India also. This was the only thing which was available and they had to do so much of work with the available resources and the tools. And the expectation from the peasants was very high. That also you should remember. So the lords will not think that with the basic resources available, how can they give maximum harvest, right? So you have to understand that there was a lot of change in the climatic condition. Along with that, the tools were also not enough. So along with all these things, so much happened. So it was done by a team of oxen, wooden plow was there, and they went on going like they were not bothered about the harvest also. So the plow, the kind of plow, could at best scratch the surface of the earth, that's all. It was not possible to draw the complete natural productivity of the soil. And you should remember that the soil was frozen. So with this particular system, they could only scratch the top surface of the soil. And that was really very difficult also. So agriculture was actually labor intensive. People had to work so much. They had to work so much on the land. And fields also had to be dug by hand. Everything had to be done manually. That too once in 4 years. Enormous manual labor was actually required to dig out things, to do things once in 4 years. Everything was so much of labor and so much of toiling was required on the field. There was another method which was actually followed during this time, and that was crop rotation method. It was not very effective, but it was in the system for a very long time. It was in use. Now what they did is they used to divide the land into two halves. One part of the land was planted in autumn with winter wheat. Okay, so during that time the other part of the land was left fallow. That is, nothing was done on that particular part of the land. When something was planted on one part of the land, the other half of the land remained fallow. That is, without planting anything, it was just left like that. They used to just put some manure and prepare it for the next season. The second point, rye was planted on this piece of fallow land. So this particular piece was used the next year. Annually it was done to plant rye. At that time, the field where winter wheat was put in, that was left fallow. So it was kind of crop rotation which took place. So alternatively, they used to plant the land. The soil also started deteriorating. It started going down. And famines were not uncommon. It was really common. The quality of the soil went down, and famines were also there. It was not very easy to survive in this kind of condition. Malnutrition was common, where people did not have enough to eat and to fill their stomach. Already the families were under poverty line, where they were not given enough to eat. So along with these conditions, things became very worse, and the families were devastating, and life was very difficult for the poor. It was actually going down. It was very difficult for them to thrive and survive. Now this is a diagram which clearly shows the technique or the system of crop rotation, where one part is planted and the other part is just left like that. So look at the area of the land. They have to have so much of area for them to do this. So this is how they used to actually systematically do things, but still it was not at the good being or welfare of the peasants. All the produce and everything went to the greater or the higher authorities of the society. Oppression. Because of all these problems, they had to face so much of oppression. And what was this oppression? So all these hardships was there, and in spite of all these hardships, I told you that the lords were only bothered about increasing their harvest, increasing the income, and increasing the productivity. Even if the peasants go and explain that it is because of these factors that we are not able to do something, they will not be happy to relieve them of the duty. They will not be able to understand also. So it was not possible to increase the output from the land. It was very difficult to increase the output from the land. And peasants were always forced to work on the land to bring out the maximum out of cultivation, especially in the manorial estate. And they spent much of their time doing this than they were legally bound to do. So maybe you will have a particular number of hours to work on the field, right? So now it was not like that. They will make the peasants work for more number of hours. They were legally allowed to do, or they were legally allowed to actually work for a particular number of hours, but it went beyond that, and nobody could complain regarding that. Of course, the peasants were not happy about this, and they did not bow very quietly to oppression. They were very dissatisfied. And if they protested openly, what will happen? They had to face the consequences, very harsh punishments. They actually went for passive resistance. They tried to tolerate. They resisted, and they expressed it amongst themselves. They did not talk about it openly. Openly, they were not able to express about it. They had passive resistance skills. And they spent much of their time cultivating their own land. So you should remember that they had their own field and the manor's field. And they kept much of the product of the labor for themselves. So now what they could do is not to give much of their produce to the church and to the Lord. So whatever they harvested from their field, they kept it for themselves, because they had to actually give and provide for their own families. and the state was not doing anything to provide for them. So they kept half of the produce for themselves. And what they did is they avoided the Lord whenever they used to call them for performing unpaid extra services. What were those unpaid extra services? It is given in one of the previous audios, like doing the plumbing work, doing all the other woodwork and all those things, which is very personal, and those unpaid extra services were completely avoided. And because of that, eventually they came into conflict with the lords over pasture and forest lands. Because even though they had their own fields, you should remember that they did not own it. And because of that, there was so much of conflict. And land was supposed to be a resource which had to be used by the whole of community, but that was not the case. Most of the authority and the ownership was by the lords, and the lords always treated it as their private property. And because of this, there was a great conflict with the lords, especially over pasture and forest lands. Now, what was the kind of new agricultural technology which was coming up in the field? By the 11th century, there are a lot of evidences of several technological changes. So many things happened from 11th century, and you should remember that because of all these developments, there was a change in their economic and also social and cultural factors. So just by using the basic wooden plows, they were not satisfied. The cultivators started using heavy iron-tipped plows and mold boards. I will show you the picture of these two implements in the next slide. So these two things were actually used instead of the basic wooden plows. And these plows were able to dig much deeper, and the mold boards turned the topsoil properly. So when it's like, churning, the lower part will come to the surface, and the surface will go to the deep down. It will go deep down into the soil. So it was able to dig much deeper, and overturning was happening, because of which cultivation and also the soil also came up. The good soil came up. So because of that, they were able to get an access to the nutrients from the soil, and that was better utilized. There was a method that they used for harnessing animals to the plow that also improved, using the animals to the plow. Instead of the neck harness, that is by having the tie-up on the neck, the shoulder harness came into use. They used the shoulder part. Because neck was like, it created a lot of strain for the animals also. Shoulder harness means they were able to bear the pain also. So because of that, the animals also were not tired, and they were able to give their complete productivity and exert greater power. Horses were now better shod. That is, the shoes that were made for the horses were better, with iron horse shoes, which prevented foot decay. So when they had foot decay, the horses will not be able to work. It will create much frustration and irritation. There was also an increased use of wind and water energy. They started tapping wind and water energy, especially for agriculture. So more water power and wind powered mills were set up all over Europe, and that was used for milling corn and pressing grapes. Instead of doing it manually like children and women and men used to do all these things, instead of doing that, they had water power and wind powered mills which were actually used over it. Now I have given the pictures of the heavy iron-tipped plow and the mold boards. Look at this. It was capable of not only scratching the soil, but also overturning the soil. That helped in understanding the texture of the soil, and also they were able to upturn the soil, which made them access the nutrients from the soil also. Very beneficial to the peasants. There were a lot of changes which came about in the use of land. The most important and revolutionary change was the switch from two-field system to three-field system. Earlier it was crop rotation, where it was two-field system, where one crop is planted on one half, the other part of the land remained fallow. Now it is three-field system. Now the peasants, what they did is they could use a field for 2 years out of 3. For 2 years they could use a particular field. Okay, if they planted it with one crop in autumn and a different crop in spring a year and a half later. So earlier it was like they could only use one part of the land in a year. Did you understand? Suppose a field is divided into two, only one part of the land was used in a year. Now, two parts of the land were used but not in the same season. That is very important. If one particular part is used in autumn, the next part will have to be used in spring. And then the next. So that is how the rotation was done. I hope this particular point is very clear to you. Okay.